Hey, welcome to episode 102 of Awkwardly Awesome Podcast, Wisdom in the Land. This episode is dear to my heart for so many reasons. For one, we're going to talk about education, which just fascinates me how we can learn better and expand on how we're teaching our youth and two, I've known the guests my whole life, and three, we're talking about nature and crafts and just amazing things. So with that, I'll be back in a sec, but for now,
today's guest, Chris Schellinger.
Hey, welcome back to Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. Let me tell you about Chris, our young Uncle Chris, as he's known to me, being only a few years my senior. Chris has lived and worked in beautiful central Minnesota his entire life, holding a number of organizational leadership positions over the years, most recently as the executive director and founder of the Avon Hills Folk School. The folk school is set on beautiful land of hills and forests in central Minnesota. During his tenure as president of a private elementary school, Chris began to wonder if there was a better way for children to learn and discover their interests and talents. Upon discovering the TimberNook program, Chris saw a great opportunity to offer children these education opportunities at the folk school he created. TimberNook invites kids to enthusiastically explore the intersection of art and nature. When not at his day job or working on the ever-expanding Avon Hills Folk School, Chris can be found gardening, hunting, fishing, mushroom gathering, or doing just about anything outdoors. Please help me welcome Chris Schellinger.
Hey, Jason.
Hey, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
We know each other's names, which is good.
Yeah, that's a good start.
How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good.
Do you want to hop right into it or make small talk?
I think we can hop right in. I think we got the small talk out of the way.
Awesome. So I was going to ask you one question to start, but I'm going to ask you another. Why is the intersection between art and nature an important intersection?
Well, that's a good question. Nobody's asked that specific question before. A couple of reasons, possibly. Well, one is you mentioned the Avon Hills Folk School. We exist here in the central Minnesota in the Avon Hills, and that is a bit unique. That we as a folk school have this fairly large 64 acres natural setting. So we decided early on that we wanted to make that kind of one of our themes or one of our guiding principles is exploring that space, that intersection of art and nature. There are things that can only happen in that space. There are things that can happen best in that space. And so while not everything we do falls there, we see that as kind of maybe our unique differentiator as a folk school. And so we like to kind of try to explore that and put that out to people and see what they come up with.
What's an example of a folk school activity?
Well, I'll give you one. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of them. So,
Dozens and dozens and dozens?
well, people ask, what do you do? In some folk schools, they choose to focus on a particular niche. I mean, I think there's some that do just say Irish folk dancing only. And then there's some North House and Grand Marais, a phenomenal model. They teach and share Northern crafts. We do not yet have that type of a focus. But if we talk about an example of a class that really embraces the intersection of art and nature, I'm going to use one that we did a couple of years ago. We brought two really, I call marquee artists to campus. We had Gaylord Shanilak and John Coy. John Coy is an award-winning children's author, really kind of a big deal, great guy. And Gaylord is internationally known. He's a print relief artist, and his work appears in museums and private collections. And they had just finished a collaboration called My Mighty Journey. It's a museum-worthy children's book. It's about the 12-mile, 14,000-year journey of St. Anthony Falls, the only waterfall on the Mississippi River.
Wow.
And they spent 5 years in that collaboration. And I was connected with John and Gaylord through a friend and called Gaylord, had talked to John Coy as well, called Gaylord and explained that we had a folk school with a creek running through it. And we wanted him and John to come up here and basically do what they did with My Mighty Journey, but we wanted them to do it in 3 days instead of 5 years.
Oh.
And they agreed, thankfully. And so what they did is we brought a bunch of students together and they learned the art of print relief making. And John brought in his literary piece. His was called Simplicity in Words. Gaylord's was called An Adventure in Print Relief Art. And they would go out into the woods and down to the creek, and they would experience and explore nature and have together time and alone time. And they would find places and pieces of the natural world that really spoke to them. And then they would come back and, using some natural paper, we didn't make that at the folk school during that class, they created their own book collaboratively amongst the group over that 3 days. We've also done paper making, which is kind of a part of that, which comes from the land. And so those are a couple of examples of where you're really, I think, almost perfectly tying in the natural world and art, and you're working in that intersection, in that space, and what can happen. And in nature, literally, many of our classes and experience are literally in the woods.
You mentioned before we got on that it's not only the intersection of art and nature, but also the community that develops around the community that develops that as people are doing these types of activities.
Absolutely. That's the feedback that we get at the end of every single experience in every single class. I'll steal a quote from a student up in North House, Grand Marais, that I read years ago. He said, I came expecting to learn this skill, this craft, this knowledge. He said, what I did not expect is the relationships and the sense of community that I would experience and that I would leave with after the fact. And so you see that happening every single time. And it's, I often say that folk schools are just a red herring. They're a delivery vehicle for creating community. And they are. Many missions talk about community in their mission statement, as does ours.
If someone, I have plenty of questions for Chris, but if someone has a question or a comment, please chime in. Thanks. So someone might go, yeah, but Chris, I can create community on Zoom with people around the world. So how is the community created at a school different than any of the other modern day communities?
Well, as a fact, certainly during the pandemic, many folk schools did pivot to trying to do some things online through Zoom
Oh,
or some other facets so that they would still maintain some of that connection. It's kind of hard for me to answer that, Jason, because the answer seems so fundamental and basic. It's kind of hard for me to respond. But it really, for me, it's nothing less or more than the difference between not being physically in the same space with someone and being physically in the same space with someone. You're feeling the same weather, you're feeling the same breeze, you're hearing the same birds, you're touching the same grass, you're walking the same trail, you're crossing the same creek, you're eating the same foods, sharing the same table. I'm sorry, but that is entirely different. And we want to try to make that opportunity available to as many people as we can. And sometimes that's an accessibility issue and we know that accessibility means many, many, many things.
what occurs to me as you said that is like you bring people together to also encounter the same challenges. Like paper making sound, I've never done it. It sounds really challenging. So building a timber frame sounds challenging. So can you say something about how the challenges of these different activities draw people closer?
Yes. You're whether you know it or not, you're hitting on some of the themes of a folk school in that it is, in addition to being intergenerational and involving all types of people, it involves people of all different skill levels. And folk schools are non-competitive. There really isn't that sense of competition. And people just seem to gravitate towards helping others when they need it. People rarely feel intimidated at the end. First, they do. Oftentimes, they're not sure how they're going to stack up against the other people that are there. But it is a very supportive environment. And so while, yes, there are challenges, and some people simply are more comfortable doing some things than others. And when you have a group of people with different skill sets, experiences, fears or strengths, you all just often just fall into place and you support the process and the project in the way that you can. And it always seems to work out.
That's huge that it's non-competitive and takes people of all skill levels because it's easy. I know for me personally, it's easy to look at something like timber framing, paper making, something, and just hear the voice go off in my head that I could never do that. But you're saying, but are you saying that you take people in and teach them sometimes what they don't think they're able to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, usually people, of course, they're picking something because they have an interest in it. They're not being forced into it or thrown into it. So they have some interest in the class or the experience, and so they're starting with that. But very often people will come and they're a little bit, they're unsure. They're a little hesitant. They're not sure how they're gonna do. They might even be a little bit scared about it, but I usually hear about that differential, that delta between how they felt when they came and how they felt when they left. And there's a lot of progress there.
And sounds like a lot of confidence too. If someone comes in thinking, "Oh, I won't be able to do this," and goes out being like, "Hey, I helped build whatever that is, or I helped make that," that's a confidence booster, huh?
Yeah, it's huge. Particularly, I think those opportunities are less and less, and to be able to come and create something tangible, and it doesn't matter whether you did the most complicated piece on the timber frame or made the most beautiful piece of paper, but you did something along that way. You contributed to that, and again, I just it seems very basic, but it's all relative. It's all relative to your starting point, and it's the ultimate grading on a curve.
Nice,
But
nice.
but there are no grades, to be clear.
So, that's good. So now I'll hit you with a question I told you I was going to start with before I asked all the other questions. So how did you come up with the idea of creating a folk school? Folk schools are relatively unique, and you created one, you founded one. Did
Right?
that just come to you one night?
No, no.
No.
Yeah, it followed another, I'll say, need or goal. So the folk school happens where I grew up, and we had wanted to preserve that land and maintain it. And pretty quickly after deciding that we wanted to do that, in conversation with my parents, thought there should be some type of mission associated with it. Preservation for preservation's sake is fine and good and important and needed, but could we tie some mission to it? And I had been going up to North House Folk School in Grand Marais for a few years. This is probably 10 or 15 years ago now already, and really just embraced and enjoyed that atmosphere and what they did, and felt that we could do that here. And I have to, there's a lot, as you know, your grandpa Francis, my father, he looms pretty large around here, and we often say that he was running a folk school unintentionally before it was even a thing. It wasn't an intention that he had, but he really practiced many, many, many of the same tenets. He knew how to build community. He knew how to throw a party. He knew how to bring people together. An example that I often give is somebody came over to the place one day, and my dad, your grandpa, was a contractor and had been retired, and so this person wanted to put a chimney on the outside of their house, and he assumed that Francis would know who to call. And he said, "Franny, I want to build this chimney. Who should I call?" And my dad, and this strikes pretty close to home for you, Jason, because of the massive stone fireplace that your mother laid by herself. And my dad said to this guy, "Well, you can do that. Hell, you can do that." And the guy kind of looked at him and says, "I can?" He says, "Well, yeah. You have the rocks over there? You got the field stone?" "Well, yeah." "Well, what are you doing this afternoon?" "Oh, well, I'm home." "Okay, well, I got to finish this, and I'll grab my tools, and I'll be over." And so he goes over there and shows him how to mix the mortar, and lays up a row and hands it to him and say, "Okay, now you do it." Makes a few corrections, and he says, "Okay, go till you get to the top. Call me if you get in trouble." And he would do that a lot, and that's just so folk school-esque that you just couldn't even make that up. And I'll share one other little thing that a friend of mine, a board member, Mark Conway, just is he's always so amazed at this, and I am too, why I would remember this very, very granular example. When I was 8 or 10 years old, we were doing some kind of manual labor, which we did a lot of on the property. And Dad just stopped at one point and saying, as if to nobody in particular, I assumed me because I was the only other person there, and he kind of looked around and he said, "I imagine this place someday being a retreat for jaded businessmen, where they could come out and just kind of get recharged and get out of the grind." And I mean, it's very Thoreau-like, and that just kind of resurfaced when we were thinking about the folk school. And so anyway, long answer to your short question, why a folk school? That's why. And I think we need them.
a huge folk school type project that comes to mind as you mentioned my mom laying out the fireplace is grandpa framed in the house and brought you down. And what do you remember about the experience as being a young person and suddenly doing it what must have been intense manual labor day in and day out?
What do I remember about framing your house?
Yeah, about the experience of coming together as a community to build a house.
Well, you know, a lot of I think Jason, a lot of things that we remember are in hindsight, right? They're not certainly not what we thought at the time. You know, before I answer your question, one funny story. I remember well, there was no power equipment involved when there's no nailers. I remember we were nailing down the subfloor and I was I was nailing the subfloor down, and I got to the point where I was literally laying on my side and pounding the nails in. And it was probably 4:30, 5 o'clock, 5:30, and then your grandpa said, "All right, that's it. That's enough for today. If we're laying down while we're pounding nails, we're done." But what I remember about that in hindsight, given some context, is I think that, you know, one thing your grandpa wrote on the header above the front door is that this house was built by one old man, one middle-aged woman, and a young boy. And I remember people coming out and seeing the project, helping in different ways. And I would just imagine that was enabling for people, that they would see this and think, God, maybe we could do this. Maybe we don't have to just have someone else do everything for us. Maybe we can do part of this. So it was, that's a memory that I take from that.
You mentioned talking about all these projects and creating things with by hand and talking about grandpa, of course, gets me really brings back a lot of good memories and gets me excited for about what can be done in the future too. But before we got on, you were mentioning that you feel folk schools are kind of the antidote to the rapid technological expansion that's constantly happening. Can you say more about the origin of folk schools
Sure.
and then how it can be an antidote?
Right. So folk schools originated in Denmark in the 1800s, and they were based on the writing of a guy named Grundtvig. And
I'm impressed by that you can pronounce that. That's good.
Well, I'm probably not saying it correctly. There will be all kinds of Danish people online here that will correct me. And he never actually founded a folk school, but he wrote about the concept of a folk school, and he was reacting to some of the earliest signs of the Industrial Revolution, where things were being mechanized and mass produced, faster, cheaper, different, right? Well, one of the consequences of those things is the skills and the knowledge necessary to create some of those handmade items went away within a generation. And along with that, the very real community that occurred around those skills and those traditions. And so he was lamenting that and wanting to see a school for the people, folk schools that would preserve that knowledge, those experiences, those craft, those skills, that art, and the community that necessarily, springs up around that. And so there were other people in Denmark off of his readings that started folk schools, and they have folk high schools there. to this day. And so in the
Wow.
early 1900s, and I'm probably being a little free and easy with the dates here, but in the early 1900s, it started to be imported or exported to this country. One of the earliest ones, I believe, is John C. Campbell in North Carolina, I think 1930s. And so today we have probably somewhere between 100 and 200 folk schools. Somebody knows the answer to that. The Folk School Alliance probably does. And I was having a conversation recently, this gets to your point, about we are in a similar place, or maybe even quite a bit down the road of that Grundtvig was looking at the Industrial Revolution. We're looking at the technological revolution and how absolutely dramatic and frankly traumatic the change has been. If we think of the change that has been impressed upon us as human beings within the scope of our existence as a species, it is probably not even measurable, right? It is so infinitesimal, yet it has been literally this cliff of a graph of change that we have gone through. We are losing not just skills and knowledge and ability, but just inherent experiences and practices and senses of community that I'll sum it this way. There are consequences to that. I don't know what they all are, but a folk school and the activities that occur there are, I don't want to say they're quite the opposite, but they are maybe the answer or the opposite. We'll say the opposite to some of the technological changes. And technology is not all bad, obviously. Many, and most of it is quite good. But there are some real inherent things that we have inside of us that I think are going to be negatively impacted if we aren't also able to feed that side of our humanity, and that's part of getting together in community, in nature, in the natural environment, working with our hands, making things, building things. There are consequences to just leaving that all by the side of the road in the blink of an eye. And so I think that this offers some antidote to that.
What would you say about blending of technology with the learning of more traditional skills? Because you're obviously not against technology. You're on a computer talking to me right now. Can the two worlds be blended, or is it kind of an either or thing?
Certainly they can. I'm probably not the right person to answer that question because I kind of personally, I want to pick an either or, right? I want to fully embrace and immerse myself in the analog, if we want to call it that, for a period of time, call it checking out, if you will, and then get back into it. But certainly there are, we're talking about examples like that to make the activities and the experiences of the folk school maybe more accessible and more agreeable to some youth in particular. There are a lot of really impressive apps and tools on their phones that could maybe be the gateway to them understanding and engaging in nature or some aspects of art. So we're not opposed to that. I'm probably not the right person to be the facilitator of something like that.
Speaking of youth, what do you observe about the educational system, both what's working and what isn't, when you were working with the private school?
Well, I have my opinions and my experiences, and I'll just say that they're not broad nor deep because it was only a 4 or 5 years that I was involved with that. But I would say that my thoughts are not limited to the educational system. My thoughts are more broadly about how we provide opportunities to our kids these days. And I'll say that it's hard, right? It's really easy to sit and speculate and opine about all the right ways that you can do things. But the reality is it's really damn difficult. Everything from many, many different backgrounds and perspectives and languages and understandings coming together and trying to navigate that. Issues of access. It's endless. It's really quite overwhelming. But a few basic beliefs that I have is, one, our expectations of our kids, I think, often fall far, far short of what they're capable of. And
our expectations of our kids often fall far, far, far short of what they're capable of.
Yes,
that's fine. Go ahead and continue.
I see kids today being shepherded along, told where to be, when to be there, what the rules are, what they can do, what they can't do, what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong. They have conflict solved for them. They have creativity directed for them, as opposed to what we, and this lead into the TimberNook programming that we started this year, as opposed to giving kids the space and the time to explore all those things on their own and together as kids. I think every time we help a kid to decide what they want to do, every time we interject in a conflict, every time we give a long list of rules, every time we say no, every time we rob them of their opportunity to develop their potential, their confidence, everything. And it's really unacceptable, and it's endemic right now. And what we see with the TimberNook programming is we see them growing in their creative confidence, their physical confidence, their social, emotional, their collaborative skills, their conflict resolution skills. They just know what to do. And if adults would just get the hell out of the way, make sure they're safe, and then let them be kids. I fear for the adults that we are cultivating with these narrow and high guardrails that we've placed next to them.
So the TimberNook program, you just drop your kids off and you say, go do anything, kids, and be back here in 8 hours, or how does it work?
No, it's not quite like that. That's more like what your grandpa did when he loaded up the travel and brought the kids out to the farm and hoped that at the end of the day he had the same number in the travel when he went home as he did when he nice. No, a typical TimberNook day looks like this. So the adults come and they drop their kids off, and we have 4 to 7-year-old programming and then 8 to 12-year-old programming in that group. So it's multi-age on purpose. The older kids help the younger kids see what the big kids are doing, and they really work well together. So they drop their kids off. We have a little circle time where the kids, if they want, they say their name, and then we ask them to answer a question. You know, if you were an animal, what would you be? If you were a bird, where would you fly? Those kinds of just little things, right? And then everybody sings a song just to kind of get loosened up. You know, icebreaker, we call that in the adult world, right?
Is it like does TimberNook have an official song? Or is
No. It's sometimes the song is consistent with there often is a theme. There's a theme for the experience that the only structure, if you want to call it that, or guidance or direction, is what I'm going to call it's an inspiration and an opportunity. And so we walk down after that circle time. We walk down and into the TimberNook woods, and it's a little bit of a journey. So there's this sense of going someplace else, this sense of arrival, right? And the kids put their little backpacks up, and then they sit down and they have a snack, and then we read a story to them. And kind of the classic example that I use, because I think most people know this and they can wrap their head around this example, is we'll read Three Little Pigs. And after that's done, then we say, you now have the opportunity to build your own little houses or relive this story in your own way. And that's it. That's all the direction that we give. There are what's called loose parts. And so for a particular story, there might be unique loose parts. So for Three Little Pigs, there'd be a pile of straw or hay. There'd be a pile of bricks. And then, of course, in the woods, there's lots of sticks. And then they just go. And
Sounds
they
really cool.
Yeah. Some kids choose to just go right to those things and start to build. Others will just go off and climb trees and explore. They have the ability and the agency to do whatever they want. There are only two rules. Be kind, and you've got to always be able to see an adult. And so the adults they're really paying attention. They step back and they tune in. They're listening, they're watching, they're seeing facial expressions. They're making sure that the kids are safe, that they are being kind, but they're really able to stretch their boundaries and explore and do some things that they don't normally get to do. TimberNook was founded by Angela Hanscom. She's a pediatric occupational therapist in New Hampshire. Here, I'll give a plug for her book. Sorry, it's not awkwardly awesome, but so there's her book. Balanced and Barefoot. And yeah. One of her quotes, and she has many, is that children should be allowed to do things that make adults gasp.
Children should be allowed to do things that make adults gasp. Do we oftentimes like try to helicopter parent kids because as an adult we don't want to feel discomfort about what they're doing?
I think mostly comes from a good place, right? Parents want their kids to have positive experiences. They want them to be happy. They want them to be successful. They want them to be safe overall, above all. But they can be all those things and still have the freedom and the space and the time to become this is, a little bit sappy and overused, but to become their best self, really, to really fully realize their potential. And if they're constantly being shepherded and given all these rules and told what to do, not to do, I see kids becoming adults, and this is manifesting itself where they can't deal with uncertainty. They don't know. They need to be told what to do. Just tell me what I need to do and how I need to do it. I think that there is increasingly a drought of creativity and resilience because of that.
So I love that TimberNook strikes a balance. It's just not dropping kids off and say, hey, be back by the main house at the end of the day. But so you said the rule is they're always inside of an adult, but within that safe structure, they can basically explore and do what they want and make their own decisions.
Right.
Jason,
I don't have any letters behind my name, and I don't have the degrees, and so I have to be a little bit careful and acknowledge that. But there's a thing that happens in TimberNook is that the kids learn to self-regulate. What does that mean? They learn to self-regulate in their interactions with each other, whether that's social, emotionally. They learn to self-regulate when they're physically stretching their limits. How high this tree can I climb? If they aren't given those opportunities to test those boundaries, when will they? right? When are they going to learn that skill? Because it is a skill. So that's something pretty exciting to see. And I should say that not everything we do with youth is TimberNook. That's one program under the umbrella of the folk school. We have lots of experiences where the kids will come and experience nature for nature's sake, but oftentimes we do have instructors, makers, some form of art or creativity making that's going on, and that's a bit more structured. That really is more of an activity, where they are working on something, but there's ways to kind of blend the two.
There's so many questions I want to be sure to ask before we get to the top of the hour. We talked about what you learned from your dad about nature and crafts and creating someone. What did you learn from your mom about the same? About nature and beauty and creating?
Sure. Well, as you know, she really kind of cultivated the beauty around the home place with many different types of flowers and plantings. She's a master gardener.
So Chris is being really modest here. The gardens around the house they've been phenomenal. They've been phenomenal my whole life, and it's just such a beautiful thing. Continue. I had to just.
Well, I mean that you put a good point on it. Yeah. So that's kind of a big part of her strength, and then she was always part of the sense of community too, and welcoming and entertaining and making people feel at home, which is a really important part of that. The hospitality component, we try to weave that through everything that we do. People need to feel welcome. I think, Jason, a lot about whether we're talking the folk school or your house or your classroom or your job site or whatever it is, at the end of the day, when you leave that place, your memory is a series of first impressions. There's not one first impression. There's many that are layered one upon the other that establish that experience. And so we try to work on that, and hospitality is a big piece of that.
Speaking of hospitality, thanks for the segue. What the heck is booyah?
What the heck is booyah? Well, first of all,
I have no idea, Chris. So
you do too. It's not spelled Booya. That's a misspelling in my book. It's spelled Bouja, and apparently it's originates from some of the Low Countries, I guess, in Europe. But it has a rich tradition here in Stearns County, along with whiskey, and Stearns County, Minnesota. Booyah is typically 3 meats, a bunch of vegetables, some spices, and you cook it in a big pot. I don't think it can be called booyah unless it's 25 gallons or more. And we have that party coming up on October 8th, and we call it the Avon Hills. Actually, we don't call it Avon Hills because we don't want it to be exclusive. The annual community booyah party, and anybody that wants to come can come, and we make 55 gallons of the booyah, and it's usually
that's a lot of soup.
That is a lot of soup. Yeah. We made it so it used to be chicken, beef, and pork, and we swapped the pork for lamb about 3 years ago, and we wanted to make it accessible for our Muslim neighbors and Jewish neighbors and anybody else that decides they don't want to eat pork. And actually, it is markedly better tasting. I don't know. It just almost got a little. Hesitate to say it's a little creamier. It seems with the lamb in it. All we ask is that if you can bring a dessert to share, because we have a 32-foot dessert table.
Oh,
That
And that's always a hit with the kids and with the adults too.
right. Yeah.
At
Yeah.
least with an adult named me.
Right. Yeah. You gotta scope out the dessert table early and often. You gotta constantly watch and see what's showing up.
How about what will you be doing around March, late February, March on the land?
Well, as you know, we have a long history of making maple syrup here on in the property. So again, we're in the Avon Hills, which is glacial till. So the glaciers pushed up this dirt between them and left it there. And originally, nobody wanted to live there because you couldn't farm it, and now everybody wants to live here because it's hills and woods. And long before anybody that looked like us showed up, the Native Americans, I'm sure, were making maple syrup here. And if they weren't making it here, they were making it out east. That's how we learned about it. So yeah, we tap the trees. We've been doing it here since about 1976. And we've got a couple new buildings up out in the woods to kind of help house that and host people to come and help. And so people show up and either dip their toe in the pool of maple syrup, or no, we don't actually have a pool full of maple syrup. That's a metaphor, Jason.
I don't know anything about metaphors, so thanks.
Right. So yeah, that's a big part of the spring, and it's a great time to be in the woods. There's nothing else going on, and the days are getting long. The light is great. Creek is running. It's it can be a real magical time.
Is making maple syrup as easy as going to the store and buying a can of maple syrup or a
Pretty
bottle?
pretty much. You just put a tap in the tree and fill the bottle.
Nice.
No, that's not true. It typically is between 30 and 40 gallons of sap that you've got to cook down to get 1 gallon of syrup.
That sounds like that can get heavy. Speaking of challenge,
It is a lot of work. Yeah, that's why we try to get a bunch of people out to help with it. But people seem to enjoy it. It's a community effort. People gathering together. A lot of times, people will hang out long after the sap is carried and hauled in, and just sit around the evaporator and feeding the fire and watching the water evaporate. It's kind of nice.
so kind of like a feeling of sitting around a bonfire a little bit.
Yeah, very similar. Right, and again, it's winter is either over or ending, and people are wanting to get out, and birds are singing, the turkeys are gobbling, fish are running in the creek.
So it's kind of a way to ring in spring.
Very much, yeah, very much so.
Speaking of buildings, you have a big building in pieces somewhere. Why is this?
So yeah, so you're referring to the barn that
Correct.
in 1889, your great grandfather came from Wisconsin, and the first building he built was a timber frame barn for John Undersander, and he agreed to build it for $100. But John had to have a little keg of beer for the guys every day after work. And I took that barn down in 2016. It was
So you took it down with a group of people helping you.
Yeah, that was what I had hoped would happen. And we did get a few people come out and pull some nails one day. And but for the most part, I ended up taking it down pretty much by myself, which is not a statement of wisdom or it's just not a good idea, but it's what had to happen. So yeah, took that barn down.
It sounds epic. You took down a huge barn by yourself.
It was kind of epic, yeah. But I did realize, as I mentioned earlier, towards the end of that was going to be the easy part, because that was 6 years ago, and we have not put the barn up yet, but we are hoping that we're getting close. So it'll be 135, almost 140 years old, somewhere between there. And it is an example, most likely, of one of the last full timber frame barns that that were built in Minnesota. And so we want to re-erect that on the folk school property. And it will be a real anchor for programming, community gathering. So we're pretty excited about that. We think that will give us some real critical mass and a really incredible historical reach back to the past.
So timber framing means what for those who don't know, or
So timber
those who
framing is,
need a refresher?
yeah. So it, as the name implies, it's built with timbers, and it's basically just a series of mortise and tenons. So you've got a mortise, which is the hole, and then you've got a tenon. I got to make sure the camera, a tenon, a mortise is the hole, and the tenon fits in, and then there's a pin that just basically holds it in place. The peg doesn't really do anything. Here, I'll grab one for you. The peg doesn't really provide any strength, but it just holds those timbers in place. And so you have a series of those, and put together, you have a frame and a structure. It's incredibly strong. Speaking of industrial revolution, when dimensional lumber started being sawn and something called balloon framing came onto the scene in the 1880s, timber framing disappeared within a generation. And we lost, for the most part, we lost that ability and that skill set. Timber framing came back right around the Back to the Land movement in the early 70s. And there's a gentleman named Ted Benson with 2 Ds. And I think he's generally recognized as kind of the grandfather of modern, or father of modern timber framing, bringing that back. And it's somewhat all the rage now. By the way, Jason, a quick story, if you'll indulge me, because you'll appreciate this. So this is this is a peg from that 135-year-old barn. And I did not know when I walked up to the barn the day to start taking it down how I was going to disassemble the barn. Because if you don't get these pegs out, the only way to take a timber frame barn down is to basically cut it apart or tear it down. And that was not what I needed to do. To try to shorten the story, I did figure out somehow a way to drill a pilot hole into that peg, screw in a GRK riser leg, get a grizzly bar, pry, and pull the peg out of the post.
So it requires, talk about the creativity that occurs when you're working on projects like this. You had to come up with a very creative solution to get those pegs out.
Yes, and I don't want to get too woo-woo or spiritual on you, but I don't know where that idea came from. But I don't know, but I choose to believe that I had some help figuring that out. And nice. I had taken 3 or 4 of these out, Jason, and I was feeling pretty proud of myself, right, for figuring that out. And as I was holding this peg, Jason, I realized that the last person to hold that peg was most likely my great-grandfather. Isn't that wild?
Oh my gosh. Gives me goosebumps.
Connection. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
So I'm just, these questions are woven into the fabric of what we're talking about, but I want to get them in, so I'm just going to say them.
Sure.
So what have you learned about life from gardening?
Well, that's a great question. Well, okay, I'm going to think on that some more later. But I've learned this, that you have to give it attention regularly. You can't wait. You can't plant the seeds and come back in 6 months and think there's going to be tomatoes ready to pick. There are certain things that need to happen at certain times, and that's when they need to happen. They can't wait. They can't wait when you feel like it. They can't wait when your program is over. They can't wait when the trip you want to take is over. It has to happen right now, or there are consequences that usually lead to not a very good harvest, right? And the other thing is, no matter what you do, sometimes it just doesn't turn out, and you can't do a damn thing about it. But if you stick with it and pay attention to it, you're gonna really you're gonna benefit from it. And then the last thought maybe is, it just comes to me, and again, it's a great question, Jason. I've never thought about this. Is like a lot of things, it isn't the product, right? It isn't the destination. You realize if you garden significantly, that you appreciate the tomatoes and the cucumbers and the garlic and the peppers and whatever else. But really what that garden gave you was all that time that you spent there during the summer. The decisions I've made in the garden and the things I've thought about and the conversations I've had, sometimes with myself, sometimes on the phone. It's you pick your descriptor: therapeutic, meditative, restorative, all those things. And so the lesson is that it's not about where you're trying to get to. It really is about the journey. Yeah.
Debbie says gardening, give it attention regularly, have to do more than just plant seeds. Wow. Have to water it. Well, yes.
Yep.
Water and weed, and it's a lot that goes into gardening.
A lot. Yeah, Debbie's spot on. Another phrase that comes up a lot, and I think that this applies to many things and probably applies to everyone, depending upon what it is that I think there's a lot of us that like the idea of a garden, but once you get into it and realize what's involved, you're like, oh, well, a CSA is a good idea too.
I'm raising my hand.
Yeah.
But I was at your place this summer, and I had a chance to, you took me out to the garden, and it just seemed like a sacred and gentle place, and it's not a talent I chose to work at and practice, but I definitely see the beauty in it.
Yeah, and I go overboard. My garden is too big, and I do believe that you can gain all the same benefits from, a pot in your deck, a small raised bed. Yeah, you can have all of those same experiences, and maybe with a lot less stress too. But it's all relative.
This is words for Chris. He nailed it. His comment about gardening to life relates to life so well. It does. Maybe you'll write a book about gardening, and I'll have you back on. Maybe not.
It's as good a prompt as any. That provides me the structure I need. I'll let you write the foreword.
Sweet, I'd be honored. Tim says love.
I think you had too many U's in there, not enough V's. Not Tim, you, when you were pronouncing it.
Oh yeah. My dad loves gardening. He finds it so peaceful. With gardening, you mentioned that not everything goes exactly as planned all the time, which brings up my last. I guess I have another question, but it's it's easy. But this question is: I talk in my work a lot about the power of doing our imperfect best. And what it means to me is we have the vision of what we want for our lives and our careers. Then when imperfections come up, instead of being stopped by them, we use the mistakes, whatever, as fuel to learn from and go forward. What Chris Schellinger does doing your imperfect best mean to you?
I struggle with that, Jason, because I have in my mind how the vision of how things could be or will be or should be or might be, and they seldom end up looking like that, right? Certainly not in the time frame that I want them to, and that can be, honestly, that can be kind of paralyzing for me sometimes, because it can, or overwhelming is maybe a better term. And so I mean, I think the answer is just to try and realize that there's still progress. And I think back to something a guy I worked with years ago said when I was all frustrated and irritated because we hadn't gone further faster and weren't at a better place. And he just said, hey, relax. He said, it's directionally correct, and it's a lot further than we were.
Directionally correct. What a cool term, directionally correct.
Yeah. And I think about that a lot as try to whether it's a mantra or what it is just trying to help realize that, hey, you're going in the right direction. You're not going backwards. You're not even going hard left or right. But the other thing maybe to mention is that to your point, to be open to that imperfect best and realize that there might be some real gems in that the way you thought it should be is not maybe the best outcome that could be. So to be open to the possibilities that create themselves, or that are created through that imperfect best, you see new ways of imagining and looking at things, and I think you are open to new realities that might be better than the one you thought you were going after.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's well said. Well, thank you. Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Uncle Chris.
Well, you're
young
welcome.
Uncle Chris.
Right. Thank you for that.
I could talk to you about this for a lot more hours, but our time is up. Oh, how do people find out more about the folk school?
We have a website. It's called intheavonhills.com. We are a nonprofit, and we're actually going to be changing it to a .org or org. But yeah, intheavonhills.com. You go to our website and sign up for our emails and our newsletter and see what's happening.
In the Avon Hills.
And watch for the barn raising so I don't have to put the thing back up by myself.
That sounds a little overwhelming. So is that way?
In the Avon Hills.
Yeah, I'm just learning English, so that was.
Yeah, and I don't think you definitely don't have to capitalize anything. I don't think it hurts if you do.
And it just makes it's easier to remember, I think. Yes.
That's it.
Cool. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Jason. Good talking to you.
Yeah, good talking to you. Oh gosh. So Uncle Chris and I mean, we've had lots of good conversation in our lives, but we've never had that conversation, and that was really fun, and really fascinating and inspiring. I urge you, and I urge me to remember to not think you know everything about the the people around you, about your friends, about your family, but really take time to have conversations with them and ask them questions that you haven't asked them before. And ask them for stories from the past and ask them about what they believe in and what they find important. It's just, I encourage this because it's so fun. It's so interesting. And as you know what, as you express interest in them, they might express more interest in what's valuable to you too. And and this is a way we can build community in an age where there's so much technology and so many different opinions about so many things. Anyway, thanks so much for tuning in. Next week, my guest is one of my beloved yoga teachers from San Diego who just has a phenomenal view on life, on healing, on movement. So please tune in next week to catch Heather Fenwick. Until then, thank you.